And joining me now is Daniel Hamilton, President of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening.
So President Trump says European leaders are, quote, weak and decaying. He says Russia has the upper hand. He says there should be a presidential election in Ukraine. He says Volodymyr Zelensky is the one standing in the way of peace. I mean, are we seeing in real time Donald J. Trump buckle to Vladimir Putin?
Well, the president said many things like this in the past, so I don't think these things are very surprising. I don't think that the peace plan that he had advanced is moving forward very well, mainly because Russia has rejected it, not Ukraine. And the Europeans now, with President Zelensky, are coming up with an alternative formulation. I doubt that the Russians will accept that. So unfortunately, I think it's actually just more of the same rather than any major shift. The document you mentioned and the interview that the president gave are, again, these should be no surprises. This is the way the president speaks about Europe, and the policies behind it, though, are somewhat different than what you hear just listening to him.
In this interview out today, President Trump also says, and I quote, "I think they don't know what to do. Europe doesn't know what to do." I'm interested in your view on that. I mean, does he have some kind of a point that Europe, and particularly the European Union, talks a big game, but ultimately is struggling for unity, struggling to make decisions? And I'm thinking here particularly of the Russian frozen asset standoff.
Well, that's one example. I mean, I think I would agree with the president. The Europeans don't seem to know what to do. The model that had been built during the 30 years after the Cold War was based on the assumption that there would be peace in Europe. And Putin has shown that to be false. They built a reliance on Russian energy, on Chinese markets, and U.S. security. Each of those things are in question, and there seems to be little movement in Europe to sort of reestablish its own economic vitality and to do more for its own defense. So I think there is a point here that the Europeans seem to be still slumbering along while the world is moving ahead.
I guess the question is too, we've got the Trump White House laying into Europe. We have no commitment to Article 5 in that revised US posture, this clause that says an attack on one is an attack on all. And at the same time, we've got President Macron this week insisting Europe still holds, quote, a lot of cards. Do leaders here in Europe need to get with the program to accept that America, when it comes to supporting Europe, is kind of out of the picture?
I mean, one has to, if you take a U.S. point of view, we have obligations in the Pacific and the Atlantic, and now the Western Hemisphere. And the Pentagon is very stretched. It can't do all of that all the same without some help. If there's a crisis in Taiwan and also Ukraine, U.S. forces might not be there in the way the Europeans expect that. So Americans, I think, across the board are expecting Europe to do more for its own security. And despite pledges of more money, that has to translate into real action. That'll take years to come. Hopefully the U.S. will stand by Europe while that process is underway.
Now, something appears to be brewing in the US Congress, this bipartisan bill that would still allow cash to flow to Ukraine and could even limit the ability of President Trump to withdraw troops from across the Atlantic. Is that a potential saving grace for Europe, despite Donald Trump's rhetoric? Or is it a useless piece of paper?
No, this is the bill that authorizes the entire funding of the Pentagon for the whole next year. It's a $900 billion bill. It's a must-pass bill, 3,000 pages. And just as in the first Trump term, in the second Trump term, you're seeing Republicans in the U.S. Senate in particular bucking the president when he comes to criticizing NATO or threatening to withdraw. It's a bipartisan bill now, mainly led by Republicans, that blocks the Pentagon from deploying below a threshold of forces that are about close to what we have right now, without all sorts of provisions. It blocks the Pentagon from replacing the Supreme Allied Commander, with a European. It's an American right now. It blocks them from divesting of any real estate. It stops them from removing any equipment from Europe. This is a frontal assault on the president's rhetoric about leaving Europe. It also restores funding to the Baltic states for the Baltic Security Initiative, $176 million. So the Congress, is very supportive of NATO and is doing what it can, and it is blocking the president now on the rhetorical flourishes you might see coming from the White House.
You mentioned that it's a frontal assault on President Trump. I mean, how divided is America and Washington right now between the MAGA crowd in power and, I guess, the Democrats, and you mentioned the Republicans there too in Congress, who seem adamant on backing Europe and Kyiv?
One has to always keep in mind, every poll would show that the vast majority, probably 80% of Americans, support NATO and say Europe is our major closest ally. There's been no change in that over time. You have a particular administration now that has a sort of ideological beef against the Europeans, instinctively anti-European in some ways, a civilizational approach to this. And they happen to be in the executive branch, but the Republicans in Congress, many very conservative people, simply aren't going along with it, and the Democrats aren't either. So, this is a fight. We have a normal fight in the United States on our priorities, but I think this one will still carry the day, and that the U.S. will remain engaged in NATO and committed to European defense.
You mentioned those polls, and you beat me to the punch because I've got some of those numbers here. A survey out from the Reagan Institute which shows 62% of respondents wanting Ukraine to prevail over Russia, 64% wanting the US to send weapons, and that record 68% favourability rating towards NATO. Is Donald Trump acting against the mood of his own country?
Yes. But he, when people vote, they're not voting for these types of issues. They're voting for their pocketbook issues. They voted last year for primarily domestic reasons. And here, too, the president's in some trouble because inflation, the decline in that has stopped. There's a lot of concern about what people are calling affordability, just, how expensive is your daily life? Can you meet your costs? And the president's having some trouble, addressing those issues. And the Democrats are looking good in the run-up to the midterm elections next November for the House of Representatives. So we're having our normal political debates. Europe is part of that, but it's not the lead issue. As usual, in most countries, domestic issues take priority.
So given that, do you think Donald Trump cares at all that he's working in a way against the tide domestically? Does he really take notice of that?
I think he thrives on his own, worldview. He is a person who I think is still in the 1980s in a way, and thinks he's a real estate dealer. So he thinks about these types of things, about transactional deals. He thinks Ukraine is sort of an irritant. It gets in the way of the things he'd like to do, strike deals with other big countries, and not have to deal with this type of pesky real military stuff. And unfortunately, aggression in Ukraine doesn't conform to that. And we're all dealing with the consequences of him getting his mind around that fact.
Well, let's talk about Ukraine and Donald Trump's attempt, in a way, to strike his art of the deal approach when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. He's again saying that President Zelensky is standing in the way of peace, even as Ukraine prepares to send a revised proposal, of course, ruling out any concession of land. But do you see a world where Kyiv will need to give up land to stand any hope for a ceasefire brokered by America?
I think a ceasefire, the only one that seems possible, would be around the line of control where the opposing forces now control the territory. That would be very tenuous. I don't think it would last very well. Both sides would try to seek marginal advantage. It will remain a contested area for a long time to come, regardless of a so-called ceasefire. So I don't think we should think about a ceasefire as ending the hostility between Russia and Ukraine. This conflict will go on in whatever form for years and years, because Russia is not reconciled to the post-war settlement. And as your recent episode you just noticed in the last newsreel I just saw, Russia is conducting all sorts of other attacks on European territory. So it's not just limited to Ukraine. Russia is not reconciled to the European security order as it exists, and we're going to have to deal with that. and position ourselves to confront that and deter it for another generation. This is the stakes involved here. And Ukraine, is fielding the largest army in Europe right now. It is defending Europe from Russian aggression. So we should all be behind it.
Mr. Hamilton, I want to end with one word: flattery. Because since Donald Trump returned as president, we've seen leaders of all stripes attempt to woo the president, to swing him onto Ukraine's side, towards the European project. We've even seen, as you will know, the likes of Mark Rutte, NATO's boss, calling him daddy. Have these leaders ultimately failed to convince Washington of Europe and of Ukraine's merits? And are they now fighting a losing battle?
Well, I think it really depends on whoever's in the room with the president last, because you notice a pattern. As soon as he, say, meets with European leaders, then he's all very positive again. He hasn't seen them for a while. So some of them should be making a trip here, probably. But in terms of flattery, Vladimir Putin has the same tactic. He flattered the president constantly when they met in Alaska. Everyone is doing this around the world. The only leader in the world that's not doing it is Xi Jinping of China. When they met, he hardly gave the president a glance. And he has had a much more successful approach to Trump, frankly, it seems, than to advance his own interests than almost any other country. So, tactics are something the president loves to be flattered, but I'm not sure that in the end that's really determinative.
Daniel Hamilton, president of the Transatlantic Leadership Network, thank you as always for your time.
Thank you so much.
And that's all for World News tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World for more. I'm Dahmen. Good night.